You know, it seems like everywhere you turn these days, AI is popping up, right? It's not just some far-off sci-fi thing anymore. It's actually becoming pretty core to how a lot of organizations actually, work and do their thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's everywhere and it's becoming more and more important. And the thing is with this kind of powerful technology, you can't just sort of let it run wild. You
Yeah.
really need a smart, organized way to make sure it's being used effectively
Yeah.
and that it actually fits with what the organization's trying to do.
Right, exactly. You need some guardrails in place. And so that brings us to what we're digging into today. We talked about ISO IEC 4 2001.2023 before, and you really wanted to make sure we did a deep dive into Clause 8. And, from what I've gathered, this clause is all about the nitty-gritty of how you actually do AI management. It's the operation part.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You think about it. The earlier clauses in the standard are all about the high-level stuff, like what needs to be done, the resources, the objectives. But Clause 8 is where the rubber meets the road.
Mhm.
It's about the day-to-day managing and controlling of AI systems.
Okay, so basically, this is where the lofty ideas turn into actual, actions.
Yeah.
So for our listeners out there, we're aiming to give you a super clear picture of this super important piece of AI management. We're going to go through Clause 8, piece by piece, section by section, like a guided tour, kind of ready to jump in.
Absolutely. Let's kick things off with Section 8.1, which is all about operational planning and control.
Okay, so operational planning and control. Hmm. It sounds a lot like, well, how an organization actually sets things up, right? And then how they manage all those ongoing processes related to their whole AI management system. Basically making sure that what they planned back in Clause 6 is actually happening, not just staying on paper.
Spot on. Remember back in Clause 6, they figured out what needed to be done, what resources they needed, and all that. Well, 8.1 dives into how to plan, implement, and actually maintain control over all the processes. And all of that is to make sure they're actually meeting those AI management system requirements and putting those Clause 6 plans into action.
So it's more than just like, okay, we need to do X. It's more like, okay, how are we actually going to do X? And then, of course, actually doing it and making sure it keeps happening, right? What are some of the big things organizations have to do in this section?
Well, there's a bunch of key actions that the standard lays out. First up, they have to set up clear criteria for their AI processes. It's all about having benchmarks. What does success actually look like? What levels of performance are good enough? You got to have a target.
That makes sense. Got to know what you're aiming for.
Exactly. Then second, they have to actually put controls in place to make sure those criteria are being met. This is all about putting those plans into practice, monitoring things, and making changes as you go along.
Okay, so define what success looks like and then have a way to keep things on track. Makes sense. What else? What else is important here?
Well, another key part is putting those plan controls into place, but specifically for how the AI systems actually operate. And this links back to what we talked about before, the AI risk assessment, which is in Clause 6.1.2. If the risk assessment flags a potential issue with how the AI is working, well, then the operational planning and control has to include specific controls to address that in the day-to-day running of things.
So just as an example, let's say the risk assessment says there's a potential problem with something called data drift that could mess with the accuracy of an AI model.
Right.
The operational planning and control would then have to include setting up ways to monitor for data drift and maybe even retraining the model if that drift goes beyond a certain point, right?
Absolutely. You got it. And it's not just about reacting to risks that have already been identified, right? Organizations also have to be really careful when they implement any planned changes to their AI systems. They have to think through any unintended consequences, because AI systems, they're complex. Even small tweaks can have a ripple effect and cause unexpected issues.
Oh, yeah. That's a really good point. You definitely don't want to make what you think is a minor update and suddenly things are breaking all over the place.
Exactly. And the last thing I'll mention for 8.1 is that it really emphasizes the importance of controlling anything that comes from outside. Any processes, products, or services that are part of the AI management system, but they're provided by an external party. Like if you're using third-party data or algorithms or cloud services, you got to make sure those align with your standards and they're being managed properly within your overall control framework.
So it's about having your eyes on everything that makes up your AI operation, whether it's internal or external, and making sure it all works together smoothly and that you've got proper oversight. It seems like this methodical approach is absolutely key to making sure these complicated AI systems, actually function the way they're supposed to, and they're reliable.
Absolutely. It's all about that. And, for our listeners, this is a good illustration that organizations aren't just expected to think about the initial setup. The ongoing management and control of the AI systems is just as important, and it has to be done in this structured, systematic way.
Okay, so let's move on to section 8.2, which is AI risk assessment. It feels like this kind of naturally flows from what we've been talking about with planning and control, right?
Yeah, it definitely builds on what we've covered. So, you've got the risk identification and analysis happening back in Clause 6, right?
Hmm.
Well, 8.2 takes that a step further. It says that the organization has to actively keep doing AI risk assessments. And the important thing here is that it's not just a one-time thing. These assessments need to happen at regular, planned intervals, and also anytime a significant change is proposed or made to the AI systems.
Got it. So it's not like you check the box at the beginning and you're good to go. It's an ongoing thing, like a cycle of evaluation and reevaluation.
Exactly. You always got to remember that the environment that AI is operating in, it's constantly changing. You might get new data, the AI models themselves might be updated, or even the way the AI is being used could shift. And
Yeah.
all of those things, they can introduce new risks or change the ones that are already there. So regular reassessment is absolutely essential.
So just to be clear, when we talk about performing an AI risk assessment in Clause 8.2, what does that actually involve?
Well, the clause is very specific that these assessments have to follow the requirements that are laid out in Clause 6.1.2, which, if you recall, that's where we define and analyze AI risks.
Right.
And another crucial part is that Clause 8.2 says the organization has to keep records, documented records, of all the results from those AI risk assessments.
Okay, so you can't just talk about it and identify the potential issues. You have to actually document everything, right? Seems like that would be super important for keeping track of progress and showing that you've actually done your due diligence.
Absolutely. That documentation, it's like a history, right? It shows the risks you've identified, the analysis you've done, and any conclusions you've drawn. And that allows the organization to learn from past assessments and adjust their risk management strategies as they go along. For your listeners out there, this is a clear signal that organizations are expected to be proactive. They're expected to identify and really understand potential problems that could be associated with their AI systems.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've identified and we've assessed the risks. What comes next? That would be section 8.3, AI risk treatment.
Exactly. Once you know what risk you're dealing with, you got to figure out how to address them. Clause 8.3 is all about implementing what's called an AI risk treatment plan. And this plan has to be in line with the requirements set out in Clause 6.1.3.
And if our listeners need a quick refresher, Clause 6.1.3 is where the organization figures out all the different ways they can handle those identified risks. And that could be like taking action to reduce the risk, maybe avoiding the activity that's causing it in the first place, sharing the risk with someone else, or even in certain situations, just accepting the risk.
Exactly. So in Clause 8.3, it's about actually putting those risk treatment decisions into action. They've got to implement the plan they've come up with. And, what's interesting is that the clause says if those chosen risk treatment options don't work, they have to go back to the drawing board and assess new risks. So it's this iterative thing, implement, monitor, reassess.
So it's not a one and done kind of thing. You have to constantly check if the solutions you put in place are actually doing the job and be ready to adjust if they're not.
Exactly. Hit the nail on the head. And the clause also says the organization has to review and revise that risk treatment plan whenever necessary. Because, like we've been saying, the AI landscape can change. So the risk treatment plan needs to be a living document that's constantly being updated to stay relevant and effective. And just like with the risk assessments, organizations are required to keep documented info on the outcomes of all their AI risk treatments.
So again, documentation is absolutely critical. You got to have that clear record of how you're tackling those risks. It's almost like having a safety protocol for your AI, right? Identify potential hazards, you put safeguards in place, and you regularly check to make sure those safeguards are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It really is like a safety protocol. And just like any safety protocol, you have to actively manage and update it to make sure it's effective. And for your listeners, this should highlight the proactive measures that organizations are expected to take to make sure their AI systems are reliable and safe.
All right, we're moving right along here. Next up is section 8.4, AI system impact assessment. And it sounds like this is where we zoom out a little bit and look beyond just the specific risks.
You got it. So while AI risk assessment back in 8.2 focuses mostly on the potential negative stuff, what could go wrong and how bad it could be. The AI system impact assessment, laid out in 8.4 and linked to 6.1.4, takes a wider view. The organization have to think about all the potential effects, good and bad, that their AI systems might have. And that includes looking at the impact on individuals, groups, the organization itself, and even the broader societal implications.
So we're stepping back and looking at the big picture, not just focusing on the immediate stuff like the operational risks or the technical risks.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the potential ripple effects, like what were the intended consequences? What about the unintended ones? Is there potential for bias to creep into the outcomes? What's the overall impact going to be on all the different stakeholders involved? And just like with risk assessments, these impact assessments need to be done at set intervals or whenever a big change to the AI systems is being considered.
So what's the main takeaway when it comes to the results of these impact assessments? What does the standard, say, organizations have to do with that information?
Well, the most important requirement in 8.4 is that the organization keeps documented records of all those AI system impact assessment results. That documentation, it shows that they've actually thought carefully about the broader implications, and it allows them to track those potential impacts over time.
Okay, so once again, documentation is king. It's about making sure you have a clear record of how you're addressing all those things. It's like, being thorough and responsible. It's not just about the technical stuff or the business side of things. For you listening out there, this really highlights the level of responsibility and forethought that should go into creating and using AI systems.
Absolutely. It's about taking a more holistic view, thinking about AI's role and its influence on a wider scale.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Clause 8 of ISO IE 42001.2023. It's been a fascinating journey through the operation side of managing AI.
It really has. We've seen how Clause 8 provides this structured framework for organizations to actually put their AI management plans into action. And it emphasizes that managing AI isn't a one-time thing. It's this ongoing process, from planning and risk assessment to putting controls in place and thinking about the broader impact.
To recap, Clause 8 is all about, careful planning, control, regular risk assessments, putting the right treatments in place, and doing those thorough impact assessments to understand the full scope of what these technologies can do.
Exactly. And for anyone out there listening who wants to get a real sense of how organizations are trying to manage AI responsibly and effectively in the real world, understanding this clause is crucial. It shows how those high-level principles actually translate into action.
And that leads us to a final thought for you, our listeners. As you go about your day and you encounter AI systems, and you might not even realize you're encountering them sometimes, they're becoming so integrated into our lives. Think about this. What signs would you look for that suggest the organizations behind those systems are actually managing them responsibly? Are they using a structured approach like the one we talked about today? It's a really interesting way to view the increasing role of AI in our world.
It really is. It's all around us.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.
See you next time.